The Milwaukee County Courthouse stood like a fortress of justice on East Wisconsin Avenue, its gray stone facade imposing and cold in the bitter November wind. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived early that morning, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she stepped out of her police cruiser. Behind her, Duke, her German Shepherd partner of 5 years, stretched his muscular legs and shook himself, his dark mahogany coat rippling like water. The dog's eyes were sharp and alert, as always, scanning the courthouse steps with the professional demeanor of a K-9 officer who had worked hundreds of cases. Sarah checked Duke's official vest one more time, making sure the metal badge was positioned correctly over his chest. The vest identified him as a certified police K-9, trained in explosive detection and search and rescue operations. Duke had been through rigorous training at the police academy and had proven himself time and again in the field. He was one of the finest K-9 officers on the Milwaukee force. But today, his role would be different. Today, Duke wasn't here to detect threats or track suspects. He was here as an emotional anchor for a 3-year-old girl named Emma Chen. The morning briefing had been thorough and sobering. Emma's mother, Linda Chen, had been stabbed 17 times during a home invasion 3 months earlier. The attack had been vicious and seemingly random. A man had broken into their suburban Milwaukee home at 2 in the morning while Linda and her daughter slept. Emma had witnessed everything. The screams, the blood, the violence. She had seen the intruder's face, heard his voice, watched as he ransacked their home looking for valuables. She was the only eyewitness who could identify the man now sitting in the defendant's chair. A career criminal named Marcus Sullivan, with a history of violent crimes spanning 2 decades. Linda had survived her injuries, but barely. She spent 3 weeks in intensive care, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage inflicted by the knife. Physical recovery was progressing, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. What troubled the prosecutors most, however, was Emma's trauma. The little girl had barely spoken since the attack. She had nightmares. She suffered from severe anxiety. She flinched at loud noises and refused to enter dark rooms. Getting her to testify would be extraordinarily difficult, if she could even manage to speak at all. Sarah and Duke had been recommended specifically because of their participation in the Milwaukee Police Department's community outreach program. For the past year, Sarah had been bringing Duke to elementary schools across the district, allowing children to interact with the police dog in controlled, positive environments. Emma had met Duke during one of these visits at Jefferson Elementary School just 6 weeks before the assault. According to her grandmother, Emma had talked about the experience for weeks afterward, drawing pictures of the dog, pretending to be a police officer with her stuffed animals, finding comfort and strength in the memory of that gentle German shepherd. The courthouse hallway was already bustling with activity when Sarah and Duke entered. Court officers nodded respectfully at the K-9 team. Prosecutors stood in clusters, whispering urgently about strategy. News reporters camped in corners, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any moment that might make the evening broadcast. This was a high-profile case: violent home invasion, attempted murder, a young child witness. The public was watching. The pressure was immense. Sarah led Duke to the courtroom gallery, finding a spot in the back where the dog could remain unobtrusive. She performed a hand signal, and Duke immediately lowered himself into a perfect down position, his head resting on his paws, his body completely still. To any observer, he might have appeared to be asleep, but Sarah knew better. Duke's ears remained slightly perked, his eyes partially open. He was aware, present, and ready. This was the training that made him exceptional, the ability to be simultaneously alert and calm, imposing yet gentle. At exactly 9 o'clock, the judge entered and everyone rose. Judge Harold Morrison was a stern man with 30 years of experience. He had seen thousands of cases, and he had developed a keen sense for reading witnesses, juries, and the truth. He settled into his elevated chair and surveyed the courtroom with a measured gaze. When he looked at the small girl sitting with her grandmother in the front row, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He understood the weight of what was about to happen. Emma Chen was brought forward to be sworn in. She was impossibly small, 3 years old, with black pigtails tied with pink ribbons, wearing a white dress that seemed too formal and too big for her tiny frame. A special booster seat had been arranged so she could reach high enough to see over the edge of the witness box. Her grandmother watched from the front row, clutching a stuffed rabbit that Emma had asked to bring for comfort. The bailiff explained the oath in simplified terms that a 3-year-old could understand. Emma's voice was barely audible as she promised to tell the truth. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Marshall, stood and approached the witness box with careful, measured steps. She had worked extensively with Emma and her family over the past 3 months, building trust and preparing the girl as much as possible for this moment. "Emma," she began softly, "can you tell the court what happened the night the bad man came to your house?" Emma's lower lip began to tremble immediately. Her eyes filled with tears. Her small hands gripped the sides of the witness box as if she might float away if she let go. But then the defense attorney stood. Roland Fitzgerald was a ruthless man who had built his reputation on aggressive cross-examination and character assassination. He had successfully defended murderers and rapists through sheer force of will and questionable tactics. He viewed Emma not as a traumatized child, but as a problem to be solved. His strategy was clear: make her doubt her own memory, suggest she was confused, imply that she had been coached by prosecutors. Break her testimony before it even fully formed. He paced slowly toward the witness box, his expensive designer suit catching the light. His smile was cold and calculated. "Emma," he began, his tone dripping with false sweetness, "did you really see the bad man's face? It was very dark, wasn't it? Dark rooms can play tricks on our eyes, can't they?" Emma's chin trembled. Her voice came out in a whisper so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to speak up. The questioning continued, relentless and sharp. The attorney suggested that Emma might be confusing the intruder with someone else. He implied that her grandmother or mother might have accidentally told her things that she now believed she saw herself. He used complex language designed to confuse a 3-year-old. He paused dramatically, letting silences hang in the air like accusations. With each question, Emma seemed to shrink further into herself. Her tears came faster. Her responses became quieter. Sarah felt her stomach twist. This was exactly what she had feared. Emma was shutting down. Her voice was disappearing. The girl who had been bright and animated during Duke's school visits was being systematically dismantled by a skilled attorney who viewed her as just another witness to be discredited. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to stand up, to shout, to tell the court that this was wrong. But she remained silent, watching helplessly as a little girl's courage crumbled under intense pressure. By the time the judge called for recess, Emma looked shell-shocked. She sat rigid in the witness box, her eyes staring at nothing, her small body trembling. Her grandmother rushed toward her, but court officers gently guided the child down from the elevated seat. Emma looked completely lost, utterly terrified, and dangerously close to complete shutdown. The crucial testimony that could put a violent criminal away for decades was slipping through the system's fingers like sand. Then everything changed in a single moment of inexplicable recognition. The recess had been called at precisely 10:47. Judge Morrison's voice had echoed through the courtroom with the weight of judicial authority, offering a brief respite from the grueling testimony. Court officers began their choreographed movements, some ushering spectators toward the hallways, others consulting with attorneys about procedural matters, still others preparing the courtroom for the afternoon session. The atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. Everyone in that room understood that Emma's testimony was falling apart, and with it, the entire case against Marcus Sullivan. Sarah sat motionless in her chair, Duke's solid weight pressed against her leg. She could feel the dog's warmth through her wool pants, a steady, grounding presence. Her mind was racing through possibilities, searching for solutions that didn't exist. How could they salvage this? How could they get a traumatized 3-year-old to find the courage to continue testifying against a violent criminal? The prosecutors looked equally distressed, huddled near the judge's bench, their voices too low to hear but their body language screaming frustration and worry. Emma had been led away to a small waiting room designated specifically for child witnesses. It was designed to be comforting, with soft pastel walls, age-appropriate toys, and gentle lighting. Sarah had visited the room earlier that morning and found it somewhat soothing, though she imagined nothing could truly comfort a child who had witnessed such horror. Emma's grandmother had followed her into the waiting room, likely offering whatever words of encouragement she could muster, though Sarah suspected the elderly woman was terrified herself. This case had devastated the entire family. The courthouse hallway outside the courtroom had become a mingling ground of tension and speculation. News reporters clustered near the water fountain, discussing what they had just witnessed and what it might mean for the trial. Court staff moved back and forth with the efficiency of people accustomed to the daily machinery of justice. Attorneys reviewed notes and conferred with clients. The weight of the moment was palpable, pressing down on everyone present like a physical force. Sarah decided to take a brief walk with Duke, needing to stretch her legs and clear her head. The dog responded immediately to her unspoken cue, rising smoothly and positioning himself at her side. They walked down the corridor toward the front entrance of the courthouse, Duke's nails clicking softly against the polished floor with each step. Several people stopped to watch them pass, the police dog and his handler, a striking image of partnership and purpose. Sarah barely noticed them. Her mind was elsewhere, caught between hope and despair. They had just passed the security checkpoint near the main entrance when something extraordinary happened. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Thomas, suddenly appeared in the courtroom doorway approximately 15 minutes before the scheduled resumption of proceedings. He was gesturing urgently towards Sarah, his expression indicating that something significant had occurred. Sarah's heart immediately began to pound. Had something happened to Emma? Had the defense attorney filed some motion to exclude her testimony entirely? Had the judge made a ruling that would prevent the girl from testifying further? Sarah quickly led Duke back toward the courtroom, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. Officer Thomas met her halfway down the corridor, his face flushed with excitement and confusion in equal measure. "Detective Mitchell," he said, slightly out of breath, "the judge wants you back in the courtroom immediately. Emma's requesting something specific, and the judge thinks you need to hear it directly." The mysterious summons only increased Sarah's anxiety. She had no idea what Emma could possibly be requesting. What could have changed in the past 15 minutes? What could have shifted the dynamic enough to warrant bringing her back early? She guided Duke through the courtroom doors, and immediately sensed that something had fundamentally altered about the atmosphere of the space. Judge Morrison sat in his elevated chair, observing Sarah's entrance with an expression of intense concentration. The prosecutor Jennifer Marshall stood near the bench, her face showing signs of barely contained emotion, something between surprise and cautious optimism. The defense attorney, Roland Fitzgerald, stood to the side looking confused and slightly irritated, as if he had been excluded from some important conversation that he needed to understand. The judge gestured for Sarah to approach the bench. As she and Duke moved forward, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. Emma's grandmother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her weathered face, her hand pressed against her mouth. Whatever had transpired in the waiting room had clearly affected her deeply. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his stern features softening slightly. "Detective Mitchell," he began, his voice measured and formal, "Emma has made an unusual request during the recess. She has indicated that she would like to see your K-9 officer present in the courtroom during her testimony. She specifically requested that Officer Duke be positioned where she can see him. Can you accommodate this request?" Sarah's mind went blank for a moment. The request was so unexpected, so unusual, that she struggled to comprehend what the judge was asking. Bringing a police dog into the courtroom during testimony was highly irregular. There was no precedent for it in her experience. Dogs could be distracting. They could influence juries. They could contaminate the legal process in ways that appellate courts might later find problematic. But then she looked at Emma, who had been brought into the courtroom by a victim advocate specialist. The little girl's eyes were fixed on Duke with an intensity that could only be described as magnetic. The fear that had consumed her expression during the morning testimony had transformed into something else entirely, a desperate, almost yearning recognition. "Your Honor," Sarah began carefully, "I can position Duke in the gallery if that's what's needed. However, I want to note that this is highly unusual and might create complications." "I'm aware of the irregularity," Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying a note of absolute authority. "However, I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have learned that sometimes the most unconventional solutions are the most just ones. If Officer Duke's presence provides this child with the emotional stability she needs to give truthful testimony, then that is what we will do. The record will show that this was done at the request of the witness, and with full knowledge and consent of all parties." The defense attorney started to object, but the judge held up one hand, silencing him with a gesture. "Counsel, if you wish to object, you may do so on the record later, but right now, we are going to proceed with what is best for this child and for justice." Sarah walked Duke into the courtroom gallery and positioned him in an open area with a clear sightline to the witness box. She performed the hand signal, and Duke lowered himself into his perfect down position, his entire body aligned and composed, his alert eyes turned toward Emma. The little girl watched every movement, her entire face transforming as Duke settled into place. Where there had been terror, there was now curiosity. Where there had been despair, there was now hope. The courtroom doors were closed. The proceedings were about to resume. Emma sat in the witness box, her small body appearing even smaller against the towering mahogany structure. But something fundamental had changed. Her eyes kept drifting to Duke, and each time they met the dog's steady, calm gaze, her shoulders relaxed imperceptibly. She took a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her core. Judge Morrison looked at the prosecutor. "Are you ready to continue, counselor?" Jennifer Marshall nodded, her voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of what was about to transpire. "Yes, Your Honor. Emma, are you ready to continue answering my questions?" Emma looked at Duke one more time, then turned to face the prosecutor. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice was noticeably steadier than it had been that morning. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. A 3-year-old girl had found her anchor, her connection to safety and courage, and she was ready to do something extraordinarily difficult: tell the truth about the night her world had shattered. What happened next would change everything, not just for Emma, not just for the trial, but for the entire criminal justice system's understanding of how to support vulnerable witnesses. The courtroom had settled into an expectant silence as Judge Morrison reviewed his notes. The prosecutor Jennifer Marshall stood ready, her legal pad positioned at the perfect angle, her pen poised to capture any details that Emma might provide. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keyboard, prepared to transcribe every word, every pause, every emotional inflection that would become part of the official record. The defendant Marcus Sullivan sat rigidly at the defense table, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark reminder of his incarceration pending trial. His eyes bore into Emma with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl, a silent message of intimidation and hatred. What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in Milwaukee County Courthouse history. Emma sat in the witness box, her small legs swinging slightly as they dangled above the floor. She had begun answering the prosecutor's initial questions with surprising steadiness. Yes, she remembered the night. Yes, she had been asleep. Yes, she had woken up to sounds. The fear was still there, evident in the trembling of her small voice, but it was manageable now. Duke's presence seemed to create an invisible shield around the child, a psychological force field that allowed her to access her own courage. The prosecutor was methodically walking Emma through the events of that terrible night. "Emma, can you tell us what you heard when you first woke up?" The little girl's eyes drifted toward Duke, and the dog's ears perked up slightly, as if acknowledging her gaze. It was a subtle communication, but unmistakably powerful. Emma turned back to the prosecutor and began describing sounds: loud banging, her mother's screams, footsteps running through the house. And then something completely unexpected occurred. Emma's eyes suddenly shifted away from Jennifer Marshall. They moved past the prosecutor, past the judge, past the jury, and fixed directly on something in the back of the courtroom. Her entire body went rigid. Her small hand rose slowly, trembling noticeably, and her tiny index finger extended toward the gallery, specifically toward Duke. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively, then froze in suspended animation. Every head turned. Every eye followed the trajectory of that small finger pointing accusingly at the German Shepherd resting peacefully in the gallery. "That's him," Emma whispered, her voice suddenly crystal clear and steady in a way it had not been all morning. "That's him." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. The defendant stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a sound that echoed through the chamber. "What the?" he started, but the bailiff immediately moved toward him, gesturing for him to remain seated. Judge Morrison's face transformed from judicial composure to utter bewilderment. His glasses slipped down slightly on his nose as he leaned forward, trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Sarah's heart was pounding so violently she feared everyone in the courtroom could hear it. "Duke." Emma was pointing at Duke. This made no logical sense whatsoever. Her K-9 partner had never been present during the home invasion. He had never met Marcus Sullivan. He had no connection to this crime. Yet the little girl was pointing directly at him, her finger unwavering, her voice more confident than it had been all morning. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across the keyboard. Jennifer Marshall stood frozen, her legal pad forgotten. The defense attorney, Roland Fitzgerald, seemed to be experiencing a form of cognitive dissonance. His face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. Several jurors exchanged confused glances, their expressions reflecting the collective bewilderment filling the courtroom. Emma continued pointing, her small face scrunched in concentration, as if she were desperately trying to communicate something of critical importance. Her eyes moved between the prosecutor and Duke, then back again, as if urging someone to understand what she was trying to tell them. Then Emma's grandmother suddenly gasped so loudly that several people jumped in their seats. The elderly woman stood up rapidly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the confusion like a knife. Her eyes had gone wide with sudden understanding, tears immediately forming and streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Oh my God," the grandmother whispered, but her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "Oh my Lord, the dog. Emma, you mean the police dog, the one who came to your school." Emma's entire demeanor transformed instantaneously. Where there had been desperate urgency, there was now visible relief. Her finger lowered slowly. Her body relaxed from its rigid posture. A smile, tentative but genuine, appeared on her small face. She nodded vigorously, her dark eyes bright with the clarity of successful communication. "Yes, yes, the doggy came to my school." Emma's voice rang out with childlike enthusiasm that seemed shockingly inappropriate given the gravity of the courtroom proceedings, yet somehow perfectly fitting. "The nice doggy came to my school and we petted him and he was so soft and so nice and he licked my hand." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters immediately began whispering urgently into their phones, sensing an extraordinary story unfolding before them. Several jurors leaned together in animated discussion. The prosecution team conferred in rapid, hushed tones. The defendant settled back into his chair, looking simultaneously confused and enraged. Sarah felt a flush of heat spread across her face, a combination of embarrassment, relief, and dawning understanding. Of course, Duke had visited Emma's school 6 weeks earlier as part of the community outreach program. The girl hadn't been identifying her attacker. She had been recognizing a familiar, safe presence in an environment that had become terrifying and foreign. Judge Morrison held up his hand, commanding silence with a gesture. When the courtroom had settled to an acceptable level of quiet, he turned his judicial gaze directly toward Sarah. His expression was one of intense curiosity mixed with something that might have been respect. "Detective Mitchell," the judge said formally, his voice carrying the weight of official inquiry, "would you kindly explain to this court the relationship between your K-9 Officer Duke and the witness, Emma Chen?" Sarah stood slowly, Duke rising alongside her in perfect synchronization, a partnership honed through years of professional training. Every eye in the courtroom was now focused on her. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts, preparing to explain something that still seemed surreal even as it was happening. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the emotional turbulence she was experiencing internally. "Officer Duke and I have been conducting community outreach visits to elementary schools throughout the Milwaukee district as part of our K-9 education and safety program. On October 15th of this year, approximately 6 weeks ago, we visited Jefferson Elementary School, which is Emma Chen's school. Officer Duke interacted with approximately 80 students that day, including Emma. The visit was designed to build positive community relationships with law enforcement and to help children understand the role of police working dogs." Emma's grandmother nodded so vigorously her entire body seemed to move with the gesture. She stood up further, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke without raising her hand, a breach of courtroom etiquette that Judge Morrison allowed without comment, given the extraordinary circumstances. "That's it," Emma's grandmother exclaimed. "That's exactly right. Emma came home so excited that day. She talked about that dog for weeks afterward. She drew pictures of him. She made up stories about him being a superhero dog. She was sleeping with one of those pictures under her pillow the night of the attack." The prosecutor Jennifer Marshall's eyes widened with understanding and realization. She looked toward her legal pad, quickly flipping through notes, searching for something she had written down but had not yet fully comprehended. When she found it, her head snapped up, and she turned to Emma with a gentle expression. "Emma," Marshall said softly, "when you saw Officer Duke in the courtroom today, did it help you feel brave? Did it help you remember that there are good people and good things in the world, even after what happened?" Emma nodded solemnly, her small face showing a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 3 years. "The doggy is good," she said simply. "The doggy helps me be brave." In that moment, the entire nature of the trial shifted. What had appeared to be a confused accusation had revealed itself to be something far more profound, a child's unconscious cry for the one source of safety and reassurance she could access in a moment of overwhelming trauma. Judge Morrison exchanged a meaningful glance with the prosecutor. He adjusted his glasses, settling back into his chair with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something historically significant, something that might require retelling, something that would perhaps change the way the justice system approached traumatized child witnesses forever. "We will continue," Judge Morrison said formally, with Officer Duke remaining in the courtroom for the duration of the witness's testimony. The afternoon session of the trial resumed at precisely 1:15 p.m., but the energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. The morning's tension had transformed into something else entirely, a collective sense of witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended the ordinary mechanics of criminal prosecution. Reporters had frantically made phone calls during the lunch break. Word was spreading rapidly through Milwaukee's news outlets that something unusual was happening in the courthouse, that a child witness was being supported by a police dog in an unprecedented way, that the case was taking an unexpected turn. Emma sat in the witness box, but she was a different child than the one who had testified that morning. The fear that had nearly consumed her was still present. Sarah could see it in the slight trembling of her small hands, in the occasional quiver of her lower lip. But it was no longer paralyzing. Instead, It had been channeled into something more purposeful, more directed. Emma's eyes moved toward Duke approximately every 30 seconds, as if she were drawing strength from his steady, unwavering presence in the gallery. The K-9 officer remained in his perfect down position, his body language broadcasting absolute calm and professional composure. Jennifer Marshall approached the witness box with renewed confidence, her entire demeanor reflecting the shift in momentum. She understood that something profoundly important was happening here, that she was witnessing the emergence of a child's courage under extraordinary circumstances. The prosecutor had adjusted her approach, her questions now flowing more smoothly, giving Emma moments to breathe and gather her thoughts between queries. "Emma," Marshall began, her voice gentle but steady, "I want to ask you about the night the bad man came to your house. Can you tell the court what you remember about his face? What did he look like?" Emma's eyes drifted toward Duke, lingering there for a moment longer than necessary. Sarah watched the girl's shoulders relax slightly, watched her gather herself internally. When Emma turned back to face the prosecutor, her small voice was noticeably stronger than it had been during the morning testimony. "He was big," Emma said, her words coming more easily now, gaining momentum as she spoke. "He was tall and big, and he had a mean face. He had a scar right here." She lifted her small hand and pointed to her own cheek, indicating a location just below her left eye. "A long scar, and he had mean eyes, really mean." The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath as her fingers flew across the keyboard, capturing every word with meticulous accuracy. The jurors leaned forward collectively, their expressions reflecting complete engagement and absolute belief in what they were hearing. Judge Morrison watched Emma with an expression of profound respect. He had spent 3 decades in the legal profession, had overseen hundreds of trials, had witnessed thousands of hours of testimony. Yet he seemed to be observing something that moved him on a level that transcended professional experience. This was about justice, yes, but it was also about something deeper, the remarkable resilience of a young child and the unexpected sources from which courage could emerge. The defense attorney, Roland Fitzgerald, sat rigidly in his chair, his earlier aggressive demeanor completely dissipated. He seemed to understand instinctively that attacking this child further would be a catastrophic mistake. The jury's sympathy toward Emma was palpable, almost tangible. Any additional aggressive cross-examination would risk turning the jurors against his client entirely. He made rapid calculations in his mind, weighing his options, considering whether to even bother with a cross-examination, or whether it would be more strategic to let the child's testimony stand. Jennifer Marshall continued her questioning, guiding Emma through the sequence of events with remarkable sensitivity. "Emma, what happened after the bad man came into your house?" Emma's voice remained steady as she described how her mother had screamed, how the man had run through the house, how she had been terrified and hidden under her blankets, how her mother had tried to protect her. The emotional weight of these descriptions, coming from a child barely 3 years old, created an almost unbearable tension in the courtroom. Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. Emma's grandmother sat in the front row, silently weeping, her hand pressed against her mouth. And yet, despite the emotional devastation of her narrative, Emma's delivery remained coherent and clear. She was not performing for the jury. Her testimony had none of the rehearsed quality that might suggest coaching or manipulation. Instead, she spoke with the simple, direct honesty of a young child recounting traumatic events. The authenticity was undeniable. "Emma, I'm showing you a photograph," Jennifer Marshall said, holding up an image of Marcus Sullivan taken during his arrest. "Do you recognize this person?" Emma's eyes immediately widened. Her small body went rigid. For a moment, Sarah worried that the girl would experience a regression, that the sight of the defendant's face might trigger an overwhelming emotional response. But Emma glanced toward Duke, and something in the dog's steady presence seemed to provide exactly the reassurance she needed. She turned back to the photograph and nodded with absolute certainty. "That's the bad man," Emma said, her voice unwavering. "That's the man who came to my house. That's the man who hurt my mommy." The prosecutor placed the photograph in front of the jury, allowing them to examine it while Emma's identification hung in the air like irrefutable testimony. The defendant, Marcus Sullivan, suddenly lunged to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "That kid is lying. She's too young to remember anything. This is a setup." But Judge Morrison was already on his feet, his gavel raised. "Order," he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of the court. "Mr. Sullivan, sit down immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. You will remain silent during witness testimony or face contempt charges." The defendant sat down, but his eyes blazed with rage and hatred directed toward Emma. Sarah felt her protective instincts activate, and she observed that every law enforcement officer in the courtroom seemed to shift slightly, their attention more focused, their awareness heightened. No one would allow any threat, real or implied, to reach this child. The afternoon continued with Jennifer Marshall methodically establishing Emma's credibility through seemingly simple questions. How old was Emma? 3 years old. What was her mother's name? Mommy Linda. Where did she sleep? In my room with my stuffies. These questions served a critical purpose. They established Emma's ability to communicate clearly and honestly, her capacity to remember details, her fundamental reliability as a witness. The jury watched this unfold with growing confidence in what the child was telling them. By 3 o'clock, Jennifer Marshall had completed her direct examination. She had taken Emma through the entire sequence of events systematically, methodically, and with extraordinary sensitivity. The child's testimony had become increasingly confident as the afternoon progressed. With each answer, with each correctly identified detail, Emma seemed to grow stronger, more self-assured. Duke's presence in the gallery appeared to function like an emotional battery, charging the little girl with courage that she would then expend in the act of telling her truth. Judge Morrison turned to the defense attorney. "Mr. Fitzgerald, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" The defense attorney stood slowly, deliberating. He looked at Emma, then at Duke, then at the jury. He studied the faces of the jurors and seemed to come to an internal calculation about what would serve his client's interests. After a long pause, he made a decision that revealed his tactical acumen. "Your Honor, the defense declines to cross-examine this witness at this time." The courtroom seemed to inhale in unison. By declining to cross-examine, Fitzgerald was essentially conceding Emma's credibility. He was signaling to the jury that attacking the child further would be counterproductive to his defense. It was a surprising strategic choice, but perhaps the only rational one available given the circumstances. Emma was excused from the witness stand. As she descended from the elevated structure, she turned and looked directly at Duke, offering a small wave that the dog seemed to acknowledge with the slightest movement of his tail. The bond between child and dog, forged in trauma and sealed by mutual recognition, was visible to everyone in the courtroom. Emma's grandmother rushed forward to embrace her granddaughter, holding the small child as if she might never let her go. And in that moment, everyone understood something fundamental. A 3-year-old girl had just demonstrated more courage than many adults would ever possess. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's remarkable testimony concluded. 3 weeks of waiting, of uncertainty, of the legal system grinding forward at its methodical pace, while outside the courtroom, life continued for everyone touched by this case. The jury had heard all the evidence, not just Emma's testimony, but also forensic evidence, witness statements from neighbors who had heard the screaming, physical evidence collected from the crime scene that matched items found in Marcus Sullivan's possession when he was arrested. The defense had mounted their case with competent but uninspired arguments. They called expert witnesses to suggest that young children were inherently unreliable witnesses. that Emma could have been confused about identifying details, that her memory might have been contaminated by suggestions from adults around her. But all of these arguments fell flat against the reality of Emma's clear-eyed, coherent testimony. The jurors had seen a 3-year-old speak with absolute certainty about traumatic events. They had observed her identification of the defendant's distinguishing scar. They had watched as she answered every question with remarkable consistency and clarity. Sarah Mitchell had attended most of the trial, often bringing Duke with her. The K-9 officer had become a familiar and welcome presence in the courthouse gallery. Bailiffs no longer questioned his presence. Judge Morrison had even commented privately to Sarah that Duke's inclusion in the trial proceedings should be documented for the legal record, that this case might eventually serve as precedent for other jurisdictions dealing with traumatized child witnesses. The jury deliberation room was sequestered, separated from public view, a space where 12 citizens grappled with the enormous responsibility placed upon them. They had been given clear instructions from Judge Morrison about how to evaluate testimony, how to weigh evidence, how to consider the credibility of witnesses. But what they couldn't escape was the image of a 3-year-old girl speaking with devastating clarity about witnessing violence and brutality. The deliberation lasted only 4 hours. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, the entire courthouse seemed to hold its collective breath. Reporters rushed back into the courtroom, their cameras positioning themselves for optimal angles. Spectators who had been lingering in the hallways filtered back into the gallery. Sarah sat in the back row with Duke, her hand resting on the dog's neck, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her fingers. She had no idea how the jury would rule, but she knew that whatever happened, Emma had accomplished something remarkable. She had found her voice. Emma and her grandmother were escorted into the courtroom by a victim advocate. The little girl had worn a special dress for this occasion, a pale yellow garment with small white flowers embroidered along the hem. She looked impossibly small in the vast courtroom space, yet there was something in her bearing that suggested she had grown through this experience, that she understood on some intuitive level the significance of this moment. The defendant sat rigidly in his chair, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to the formal business attire of the attorneys and court officials. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles visibly twitched. His eyes darted around the courtroom with the restless energy of someone facing judgment. Judge Morrison entered and took his elevated position. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked formally, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority that had defined his courtroom throughout this trial. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with gray-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that had observed every moment of this trial with careful attention. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the sound of breathing seemed to pause as everyone waited for the verdict that would determine Marcus Sullivan's fate. "On the charge of home invasion, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty," the foreman said without hesitation. "On the charge of aggravated assault with intent to cause bodily harm, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the charge of attempted burglary, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty on all counts." The words hung in the courtroom like thunder echoing through a canyon. Emma's grandmother let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Several jurors wiped their eyes. The defendant stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward again, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "This is bullshit," he screamed, his voice hoarse with fury. "That kid lied. This is a fucking setup." But the bailiffs were already moving. They surrounded the defendant, restraining him, preventing him from approaching the bench or the witness stand. Judge Morrison banged his gavel with sharp authority. "Remove the defendant from this courtroom," he commanded. "His outbursts are contempt of court, and he will face additional charges for his behavior today." As Marcus Sullivan was led away by bailiffs, his rage undiminished, his denials continuing to echo through the hallway outside the courtroom, something extraordinary happened. Emma looked directly at Duke, and the dog's tail began to wag, a slow, deliberate wagging that seemed to acknowledge the child's triumph. The little girl stood up in her grandmother's lap and blew a kiss toward the German shepherd, a gesture of pure childish joy and gratitude. The weeks following the verdict were intense and chaotic in ways that Sarah had not anticipated. The local Milwaukee news station that had covered the story ran an expanded piece titled "Police Dog Heals Traumatized Witness." The segment featured interviews with Judge Morrison, with Jennifer Marshall, with Emma's grandmother. The story was picked up by regional news networks. Within days, it had gone viral on social media, shared thousands of times, discussed in courtrooms and legal seminars across the country. Sarah's phone began ringing constantly. Law enforcement agencies from Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, and beyond were calling, asking how they could implement similar programs. Trauma specialists and child psychologists requested information about Duke's training and his role in Emma's recovery. Universities wanted to conduct research. The American Psychological Association expressed interest in studying the case as a potential model for trauma-informed witness support. But what moved Sarah most deeply was what happened directly between Emma and Duke in the days and weeks following the verdict. Emma and her grandmother began appearing at every police community event they could find. The Milwaukee Police Department held a K-9 demonstration day just before Thanksgiving, and Emma was there in the front row, watching as Duke performed search and rescue exercises, as he demonstrated his detection capabilities, as he showed the assembled children how a police dog could help find lost people. After the demonstration concluded, Sarah arranged a special moment. She brought Duke over to where Emma and her grandmother were standing, and the little girl's face lit up with joy that was almost incandescent. Emma wrapped her small arms around Duke's neck, and the dog lowered his head to meet her at eye level, his tail wagging with genuine happiness. "Hi, Duke," Emma whispered, her voice filled with affection and gratitude that seemed to transcend her 3 years of age. "I love you so much." Duke responded by licking the girl's face repeatedly, a response that made Emma giggle with the uninhibited joy of childhood. Emma's grandmother stood beside them, tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth as she observed the bond between her granddaughter and the dog who had helped save her life. "Can we visit you?" Emma asked Sarah, her small eyes bright with hope. "Can we see Duke again?" Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. "Duke would love to see you whenever you want." That simple conversation marked the beginning of something unexpected and profoundly meaningful. Emma and her grandmother began showing up at the police station on Friday afternoons, a time when Sarah had arranged for her schedule to accommodate these visits. Duke would hear Emma's voice in the hallway, and his ears would perk up, his entire body radiating anticipation and joy. Emma's mother, Linda, was released from the hospital 3 months after the assault. Her physical recovery was progressing well, though the psychological wounds remained. But watching her daughter interact with Duke during one of their Friday visits seemed to provide healing that no medication or therapy could fully accomplish. She wrapped her arms around both her daughter and the dog, weeping with gratitude and relief. "You saved her life," Linda told Sarah, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if Duke hadn't been there. I think she would have completely shut down. You gave my daughter her voice back. You gave her the courage to speak her truth." Sarah shook her head gently. "Duke reminded her that courage was already inside her," she said softly. "I just helped facilitate the connection." But as she watched Emma and Duke together, as she observed how the girl would arrive at the police station burdened by the weight of trauma and leave with a lightness that suggested healing was possible, Sarah understood something profound. This was more than just a successful criminal prosecution. This was about the transformative power of compassion, the unexpected sources from which healing could emerge, and the remarkable resilience of a young child who had found her anchor in the steady, unwavering presence of a four-legged friend. The story of Emma and Duke had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a local Milwaukee news segment had evolved into something far more expansive, a narrative that captured the imagination of the entire nation. The viral video of Emma testifying, her small voice clear and steady as she identified her attacker, had been watched by millions. News outlets from CNN to NBC to Fox News had picked up the story. Social media platforms had exploded with sharing and commentary. The hashtag #DukeTheCourageDog began trending nationally. But beyond the sensational aspects of the story lay something far more significant and substantive. Legal professionals across the country were beginning to take notice. Law journals published articles analyzing Emma's testimony and the role that Duke's presence had played in her capacity to speak truthfully. Legal scholars debated whether this case should establish precedent for the use of emotional support animals in courtroom proceedings. Universities with criminal justice programs created case studies around Emma's testimony. Sarah Mitchell found herself suddenly thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Her inbox flooded with emails from law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy organizations, trauma specialists, and child psychologists. Each message carried essentially the same request: how can we implement this in our jurisdiction? What is the protocol for using police dogs as courtroom support? How can we train K-9 officers to serve this function? The Milwaukee Police Department received so many inquiries that Chief James Patterson called Sarah into his office to discuss establishing an official policy. The meeting took place on a cold December morning, just weeks after Marcus Sullivan had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. "Detective Mitchell," Chief Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "you've created something extraordinary here. This case has put Milwaukee in the national conversation about trauma-informed justice. The question is, what do we do with this momentum?" Sarah sat rigidly in the chair across from the chief's desk, Duke resting obediently at her feet. "Sir, I think this demonstrates a genuine need. There are thousands of child witnesses across the country who suffer similar trauma. If we can show that the presence of a familiar, comforting animal can facilitate healing and truthful testimony, we have an obligation to explore that possibility." Chief Patterson nodded, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "I'm authorizing you to develop an official protocol for what we're now calling the Courtroom Companion K-9 program. You'll coordinate with our legal department, with victim advocacy specialists, and with the district attorney's office. I want this done properly, professionally, and with full documentation for potential replication by other departments." The weeks that followed were extraordinarily busy. Sarah worked with Jennifer Marshall, the prosecutor who had guided Emma through her testimony, to develop comprehensive guidelines. They consulted with child psychologists about best practices. They reviewed case law and legal precedents. They created training protocols for K-9 officers who would participate in the program. By January, the Milwaukee Police Department officially announced the establishment of the first Courtroom Companion K-9 program in the nation. The announcement generated immediate media attention. Local news stations ran feature stories about the program. The Wisconsin Bar Association invited Sarah to present at their annual conference. The announcement went out on the Associated Press newswire and was picked up by news outlets nationwide. Within days, law enforcement agencies from across the country were calling the Milwaukee Police Department, requesting information about the program, asking about potential partnerships. But what moved Sarah most deeply was not the national attention or the professional recognition. It was what happened when schools began requesting Duke's presence at educational events, specifically designed for children who had experienced trauma. Schools across Milwaukee and the surrounding counties learned about Duke's story and wanted to integrate police dog visits into their trauma-informed counseling programs. Sarah began receiving requests to bring Duke to schools for specialized sessions with children who had experienced abuse, domestic violence, or other forms of trauma. She worked with school counselors and child psychologists to develop appropriate protocols. During one such visit to Lincoln Elementary School, Sarah witnessed something that crystallized the profound impact that Duke was having. A 9-year-old boy who had survived a house fire was placed in a room with Duke for a 30-minute session. The child had been withdrawn and nonverbal since the traumatic event, refusing to speak even to his family members. Sarah and the school psychologist watched as the boy entered the room, his posture defensive and closed. Duke approached slowly, his body language non-threatening and gentle. He allowed the boy to touch him at his own pace. Minutes passed. The child's rigid shoulders began to relax. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly extended toward Duke's fur. And then, almost inaudibly, the boy whispered a single word: soft. It was the first word he had spoken in 6 months. The school psychologist later told Sarah that this moment marked the beginning of the boy's recovery. Having experienced that connection with Duke, having allowed himself to accept comfort from another being, the boy began to open up emotionally. Within weeks, he was speaking regularly again. Within months, his teachers reported that he was showing signs of genuine emotional healing. Stories like this multiplied across Milwaukee and surrounding communities. Sarah began documenting case studies, photographing and recording appropriate interactions with parental consent, building a comprehensive database that demonstrated Duke's impact on trauma recovery. The documentation became invaluable for expanding the program. In February, Emma's mother Linda reached out to Sarah with a proposal. Linda had become determined to channel her own recovery into something meaningful and positive. She wanted to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting trauma recovery in children through human-animal interaction. She wanted to call it the Duke Foundation, named after the dog who had quite literally changed her daughter's life. "Detective Mitchell," Linda said during a meeting in Sarah's office, "Duke gave Emma her voice back. He gave her the courage to speak. I want to create something that honors that gift and extends it to other children who have experienced trauma. Will you help me?" Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "Of course I will," she said softly. The Duke Foundation was established with remarkable speed. Linda served as executive director, drawing on her background in nonprofit management. Sarah served on the board of directors and helped develop the foundation's mission and core programs. The foundation's initial focus was on supporting the expansion of the Courtroom Companion K-9 program to other law enforcement agencies across Wisconsin and the broader Midwest. By May, the foundation had received donations from grateful families, from trauma advocates, from people who had read Emma's story and wanted to contribute to something meaningful. Major corporations began reaching out, offering to sponsor the program. The Milwaukee Police Department received a significant grant to expand training for additional K-9 officers to serve in the Courtroom Companion role. What had begun as a single case involving one traumatized child and one remarkably intuitive police dog had evolved into a movement. Police departments across Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota began establishing their own Courtroom Companion K-9 programs, modeled after the protocols that Sarah and Jennifer Marshall had developed. Judge Morrison was invited to speak at legal conferences about the case that had inspired a fundamental shift in how the justice system approached vulnerable witnesses. In June, the Wisconsin Bar Association published a comprehensive article about the program in their professional journal. The article featured photographs of Emma and Duke, with the girls' permission. It included testimony from judges, prosecutors, and victim advocates about the transformative impact of the program. It documented the expansion of the initiative and its replication across multiple jurisdictions. Sarah received an invitation to speak at the American Bar Association's annual conference. She would be presenting alongside Judge Morrison and Jennifer Marshall, discussing the case that had sparked a national conversation about trauma-informed justice. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Emma's school, Jefferson Elementary, established an annual award in Duke's name, the Officer Duke Award for Courage and Resilience. The award was given to a student who had demonstrated exceptional courage in facing adversity or supporting a classmate through difficulty. The first recipient was Emma herself, who accepted the award with a simple speech that she had written with her mother's help. Officer Duke showed me that being brave means asking for help when you're scared. Being brave means letting someone help you when you can't help yourself. Officer Duke is the bravest dog in the whole world because he helps people every single day. As Sarah watched the little girl stand at the podium, Duke sitting proudly beside her, she understood that this case had transcended the boundaries of criminal justice. It had become something far more profound, a story about the extraordinary power of compassion, the unexpected sources from which strength could emerge, and the remarkable resilience of human beings when they received the support they needed. What had started in a silent courtroom had become a movement that would touch the lives of thousands of children for years to come. 1 year had passed since the dramatic courtroom moment when Emma pointed at Duke. 1 year since a 3-year-old girl's instinctive cry for safety had sparked a conversation that would reshape how the justice system understood trauma and testimony. In the intervening months, life had moved forward in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. Emma Chen sat in her first-grade classroom at Jefferson Elementary, her small desk positioned by a window that overlooked the playground where she and her classmates played during recess. She was a different child than the traumatized toddler who had testified in court just months earlier. The nightmares had ceased. The anxiety attacks that had plagued her recovery had diminished to occasional moments of worry rather than constant, overwhelming fear. Her therapist had officially declared her trauma recovery remarkable and unprecedented for a child of her age. More impressively, Emma had become a confident, articulate first grader who excelled academically and socially. She had friends. She participated in class discussions. She raised her hand to answer questions. She laughed freely and played with the uninhibited joy of childhood. Her teachers marveled at her resilience, though many of them understood that much of her recovery had been facilitated by the presence of Duke and by the weekly visits that had become part of her regular routine. Every Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, without fail, Detective Sarah Mitchell would arrive at Emma's school with Duke. The dog would walk through the hallways to Emma's classroom, and the little girl would light up with recognition and joy that transcended the ordinary happiness children showed for their pets. For Emma, Duke represented something deeper: safety, protection, unconditional acceptance, and a connection to the traumatic events she had survived and overcome. Sarah had expanded the Friday afternoon routine to include not just Emma, but a small group of other first graders who had experienced various forms of trauma. The school counselor, Dr. Patricia Morrison, worked with Sarah to ensure that these sessions were therapeutic and beneficial. The children would sit in a circle with Duke, and Sarah would facilitate gentle conversations about feelings, about safety, about resilience. Duke's presence seemed to create a container of safety, where children felt comfortable expressing emotions that might otherwise remain locked away. One particular Friday session had been especially moving. A first-grade girl named Maya had recently arrived at the school, transferred from a home where she had witnessed domestic violence. Maya was withdrawn and guarded, reluctant to trust adults. During her first session with Duke, she had sat silently on the edge of the circle, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. But Duke, with his remarkable intuitive understanding of trauma, had approached Maya slowly and deliberately. The dog had positioned himself beside her, without attempting to force interaction. Over the course of 30 minutes, Maya's rigid shoulders gradually relaxed. Her clenched fists slowly opened, and finally, tentatively, her small hand reached out and touched Duke's fur. It was the beginning of her healing, a moment of trust extended to a non-threatening being, a foundation upon which therapeutic work could build. By the end of that school year, Maya had blossomed into a more confident, expressive child. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. She could speak about her experiences without shutting down emotionally. Her teachers attributed much of her progress to the consistent presence and support of Duke. Emma's mother, Linda Chen, had thrown herself into the work of the Duke Foundation with remarkable dedication. The foundation had grown exponentially from its initial establishment. What had begun as a small nonprofit with a mission to support the Courtroom Companion K-9 program had evolved into a comprehensive organization addressing trauma recovery across multiple channels. The Duke Foundation had successfully secured funding from major corporations, philanthropic organizations, and individual donors. The foundation had established a training institute dedicated to teaching law enforcement agencies across the country how to implement Courtroom Companion K-9 programs. By the end of the first full year, 42 law enforcement agencies across 12 states had established programs modeled after Milwaukee's initial protocol. Linda had become a sought-after speaker at trauma conferences, victim advocacy seminars, and legal symposiums. She spoke about her journey from trauma to healing, about watching her daughter find her voice through her connection with Duke, about the transformative power of human-animal interaction. Her presentations moved audiences to tears and inspired many to reconsider their assumptions about trauma recovery. Judge Harold Morrison had been equally transformed by the case. The experience of presiding over Emma's testimony had reinvigorated his belief in the justice system's capacity to serve vulnerable populations compassionately. He had become an advocate for trauma-informed judicial practices, writing extensively about the importance of considering the whole person, not just the legal facts, when conducting trials involving traumatized witnesses. Judge Morrison had collaborated with legal scholars at Marquette University to develop a comprehensive curriculum on trauma-informed justice. The curriculum was being taught in law schools across Wisconsin and had attracted the attention of law schools nationally. Universities were beginning to contact Judge Morrison about implementing his curriculum in their own legal education programs. Jennifer Marshall, the prosecutor who had guided Emma through her testimony with such sensitivity, had been promoted to senior trial attorney at the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office. Her success in the Emma Chen case had become the foundation of her reputation as someone who understood how to work effectively with vulnerable witnesses. Other prosecutors sought her advice and mentorship. Jennifer had presented the case at the American Prosecutors Association annual conference, delivering a compelling address about the intersection of trauma science and prosecutorial strategy. She had published articles in professional journals about best practices for interviewing child witnesses and about the importance of trauma-informed approaches to victim advocacy. Detective Sarah Mitchell's life had transformed as well, though in ways that were often overwhelming and demanding. The publicity surrounding Duke and the Courtroom Companion K-9 program had made her something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. She received speaking invitations from police departments across the country. She consulted with agencies attempting to establish their own programs. She worked with the Duke Foundation to develop training materials and protocols. Yet despite the demands of her expanded professional life, Sarah made certain to protect the time that mattered most, the Friday afternoon sessions with Emma and the other children. She understood that these moments were the truest expression of Duke's legacy, the direct connection between her K-9 partner and the children whose lives his presence had transformed. Sarah's relationship with Duke had deepened as well. The dog was now 6 years old, approaching the midpoint of his expected working lifespan. He had become something of an institution within the Milwaukee Police Department. Officers who had never worked directly with Duke understood his significance to the department's mission. The dog's photograph hung in the police station break room alongside a plaque detailing his contributions to the Courtroom Companion K-9 program. The Milwaukee Police Department had awarded Duke with a special commendation recognizing his service to the department and to the community. Sarah had accepted the award on Duke's behalf, and the photograph of that moment, Sarah standing beside her K-9 partner, both of them facing the camera with quiet dignity, had been published in police trade magazines across the country. Emma's grandmother had also experienced a profound transformation. The elderly woman, whose life had been shattered by the violence inflicted upon her daughter and granddaughter, had found purpose and meaning in supporting the Duke Foundation's work. She served as a volunteer coordinator, matching children who had experienced trauma with appropriate therapeutic resources. She spoke at donor events about her granddaughter's journey and about the role that Duke had played in facilitating her family's healing. 1 year after the trial, Jefferson Elementary School had established the Officer Duke Award for Courage and Resilience. The award was given to a student who had demonstrated exceptional courage in facing adversity or supporting a classmate through difficulty. Emma had been the inaugural recipient, accepting the award with a speech that reflected her remarkable growth and maturity. "Officer Duke showed me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Emma had said, her young voice clear and confident as she stood at the podium. "Being brave means asking for help when you're scared. Being brave means letting someone help you when you can't help yourself. Officer Duke is the bravest dog in the whole world because he helps people every single day." The video of Emma's speech was watched by hundreds of thousands of people online. It became a symbol of resilience and recovery, shared in trauma counseling centers, in schools, in law enforcement training academies. The image of the small girl, standing beside the large German Shepherd, speaking with such clarity about courage and healing, had captured something fundamental about the human experience, our capacity to recover, to grow, to find strength in connection. As Sarah watched Emma interact with other traumatized children during Friday sessions, watched as the little girl helped comfort a new student who was frightened and withdrawn, she understood that Emma had not just survived her trauma, she had been transformed by it. The girl had become a beacon of hope for other children experiencing similar horrors, a living testament to the power of resilience and support. What had begun in a silent courtroom one November morning had evolved into something far more expansive and significant. It had become a movement, a paradigm shift in how society understood trauma recovery and the unexpected sources from which healing could emerge. And at the center of it all was a German Shepherd whose simple, unwavering presence had reminded a frightened child, and ultimately thousands of others, that courage, safety, and hope were possible. 3 years had passed since that pivotal November morning in the Milwaukee County Courthouse, when a frightened 3-year-old girl had pointed at a police dog and changed everything. 3 years of transformation, expansion, healing, and unprecedented institutional change. Duke was now 8 years old, approaching the end of his active career as a police K-9 officer, yet simultaneously at the height of his legacy and influence. The German Shepherd had served the Milwaukee Police Department with distinction for 5 years before becoming the cornerstone of the Courtroom Companion K-9 program. His explosive detection work had been exemplary, his search and rescue operations had been consistently effective, and his temperament had always been calm and professional. But his most significant achievement, his true gift to the world, had been his capacity to provide emotional anchor and stability to traumatized individuals. As Duke's body began to show the natural signs of aging, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that had been forming in her mind for months. Duke had earned his retirement. The dog had given everything to his work, had served his community with exceptional distinction, and had touched the lives of thousands of people. It was time for him to rest, to spend his golden years in comfort and peace, surrounded by the people who loved him most. The Milwaukee Police Department began planning Duke's retirement ceremony with meticulous attention to detail. Chief Patterson understood that this was not just the retirement of a K-9 officer. It was a moment of historical and cultural significance. The ceremony would honor Duke's service while simultaneously celebrating the movement that his presence had inspired. The event was scheduled for Saturday, June 15th, in the gymnasium of the Milwaukee Police Department training facility. The invitations went out to hundreds of people, law enforcement officers from across the country, judges and prosecutors, trauma specialists, victim advocates, members of the Duke Foundation, and of course, Emma Chen and her family. Emma was now 7 years old, a bright, articulate second grader whose trauma recovery was considered a textbook example of resilience and healing. She had become something of an ambassador for the Duke Foundation, appearing at fundraising events, speaking to school assemblies about courage and recovery, and serving as a living testament to the power of healing and hope. Her mother, Linda, continued her work as executive director of the Duke Foundation, which had expanded to support trauma recovery initiatives across 15 states. The morning of the retirement ceremony dawned clear and warm. Sarah arrived at the gymnasium early, Duke walking beside her with the calm dignity that had always characterized him. The dog seemed to sense that something significant was happening, his bearing more formal than usual, his attention focused with particular intensity. By 10 o'clock, the gymnasium was filled. Hundreds of people had assembled, police officers in uniform, judges in their formal robes, prosecutors and victim advocates, trauma specialists, educators, volunteers, donors, and families who had been touched by the Courtroom Companion K-9 program. The massive space resonated with quiet conversation and anticipation. Chief Patterson stood at a podium, positioned on a stage that had been decorated with police department insignia and photographs chronicling Duke's remarkable career. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of Duke working in the field, participating in community events, and most significantly, images of Duke with Emma, at the trial during school visits, at the Friday afternoon therapy sessions. When Chief Patterson began his remarks, his voice carried the weight of genuine respect and emotion. "Today we honor Officer Duke," he began, "one of the finest K-9 officers to ever serve the Milwaukee Police Department. But we gather not just to celebrate a dog's professional accomplishments. We gather to honor a being whose simple, unwavering presence changed our understanding of trauma, of justice, of healing itself." The chief recounted Duke's work chronologically, his training, his explosive detection operations, his search and rescue missions. But then he shifted focus, talking about the moment that had redefined Duke's purpose and legacy. He spoke about Emma's testimony, about the child who had found her voice through connection with a dog, about the courtroom moment that had sparked a nationwide conversation about trauma-informed justice. "Officer Duke," Chief Patterson said, his voice thick with emotion, "has served as a bridge between trauma and healing for thousands of individuals. He has reminded us that justice is not just about punishment, it is about restoration. It is about helping people heal. And he has done this not through force or intimidation, but through his simple, overwhelming presence." When Chief Patterson invited Emma to come forward to present Duke with his retirement commendation, the gymnasium fell silent. The 7-year-old girl walked forward slowly, her grandmother beside her, carrying a special collar engraved with Duke's service years and achievements. Emma's face reflected a maturity that seemed far beyond her years, a wisdom earned through trauma survived and overcome. Emma approached Duke, and the dog lowered his massive head to meet her at eye level. For a moment, they stood thus connected, the child and the dog who had saved her life, whose bond had transcended species and circumstance and time itself. "Duke," Emma said, her young voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "I want to tell you something. When I was very scared and very sad, you made me feel safe. You made me feel brave. And because of you, I could tell the truth, and my mommy is safe now, and I am safe now. And I will never forget you. I will love you forever and ever." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Hundreds of people stood simultaneously, their ovation lasting for several minutes. Through tears, Sarah watched as Emma carefully placed the special collar around Duke's neck. The dog accepted the honor with perfect composure, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes moving between Emma and Sarah with unmistakable affection. Judge Harold Morrison was invited to speak next. The distinguished jurist approached the podium and spoke about the transformation that Emma's case had inspired in his own judicial philosophy. He spoke about the importance of trauma-informed practices in the courtroom, about the obligation of the justice system to serve not just punishment, but also healing and recovery. "Officer Duke has taught us," Judge Morrison said solemnly, "that the most powerful force in any courtroom is not eloquent argumentation or legal precedent. It is compassion. It is the simple acknowledgement that behind every case, behind every testimony, behind every legal proceeding, there is a human being who has experienced something traumatic and terrifying. And sometimes, that human being needs help to find the courage to speak their truth. Officer Duke provided that help. And in doing so, he has elevated our entire system of justice." Jennifer Marshall, Linda Chen, and others who had been profoundly impacted by Duke's work spoke about how the dog's legacy had rippled through their own professional and personal lives. The ceremony lasted 3 hours, a testament to the profound impact that one dog had made on countless lives. At the conclusion of the formal proceedings, there was a reception in an adjacent room. Sarah stood with Duke, watching as hundreds of people approached to pay their respects, to thank the dog, to share stories of how Duke, or the Courtroom Companion K9 program, had impacted their lives. A woman in her 50s approached Sarah with tears streaming down her face. "My grandson witnessed a house fire," she said softly. "He was terrified and traumatized. The Courtroom Companion program wasn't available in our jurisdiction, but learning about Officer Duke's story gave us hope. We found a local therapy dog program modeled on Duke's work, and my grandson is healing now because of what Officer Duke started." A young prosecutor stood in line next to her. "I've modeled my entire approach to working with child witnesses on the protocols that developed from the Emma Chen case," he said. "I've successfully prosecuted 5 cases involving traumatized children, all using victim-centered, trauma-informed approaches inspired by Duke's work. Officer Duke has saved more than just Emma. He's helped justice be served for children across my entire state." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah made a quiet decision. She spoke privately with Chief Patterson, explaining her plan. The chief, unsurprised, gave his full support and blessing. Duke's formal retirement was announced that evening. The Milwaukee Police Department officially released the dog from active service, recognizing that while his work had been extraordinary and transformative, he had earned the right to rest. The department would maintain honorary status for Duke, recognizing him as an emeritus officer whose legacy would forever remain central to the department's mission. Sarah's decision was equally significant. Duke would retire with her. She could not imagine him living anywhere else, spending his remaining years anywhere but in her home, surrounded by the people who loved him. Duke would spend his retirement in a comfortable house with a large backyard, surrounded by frequent visitors from the police department, by Emma and her family, by the countless people whose lives he had touched and transformed. The first Friday evening of Duke's retirement, Emma arrived at Sarah's home with her mother and grandmother. The house, modest and warm, was filled with the presence of people who loved the retiring K9 officer. Emma sat on the back porch, her arms around Duke's neck, whispering to him as the sun descended toward the horizon. "Thank you, Duke," Sarah heard Emma say softly. "Thank you for being my friend." Duke, his graying muzzle resting on the girl's shoulder, his tail wagging slowly, seemed to understand. He had spent his entire life serving, first as a detection dog, then as a courtroom companion, ultimately as a symbol of healing and transformation. But perhaps his greatest service was this: being present with those he loved, offering unconditional acceptance, reminding them that they were safe, that they were valued, that they were enough. As darkness fell and the stars emerged above Milwaukee, Detective Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the child and the dog together on the porch. She understood that what had begun in a silent courtroom 3 years earlier had evolved into something transcendent, not just a story about justice, but a story about the remarkable power of compassion, about the unexpected sources from which healing could emerge, about the eternal bond that could form between a traumatized child and a dog who simply showed up with unwavering love and presence. Duke had changed the world, not through force or authority, but through the simple, overwhelming gift of being present with people in their pain, reminding them that safety was possible, that healing was possible, that hope could emerge from the darkest moments. And now, in his retirement, Duke would continue his most important work, reminding Emma every single day that she was brave, that she was loved, and that the connection they had forged in trauma could transcend into something eternally beautiful and profoundly healing. The bond forged in that silent courtroom would last them both a lifetime, and the legacy they had created together would continue healing countless others for generations to come. The end.